Comment below where you're watching this from and what time it is right now. I read everyone. The northern stretch of the Bangor and Aroostook rail line runs through 50 miles of thick spruce swamp and granite ridges in upper Maine. In late October, when the timber companies haul their last loads before the heavy freeze, that corridor is one of the most isolated places east of the Mississippi. I spent 6 years working as a night track inspector for the regional freight carrier. My job was simple: drive a modified heavy-duty Ford F-350 equipped with retractable steel rail wheels, creeping down the line at 20 miles an hour between midnight and dawn to check for split rails, washed out ballast, or fallen timber. It was boring work most nights, the kind that made your eyes ache from staring into the yellow tunnel of headlight beams bouncing off rusted iron and wet wooden ties. You listened to the rhythmic clack-clack of the steel wheels, drank lukewarm gas station coffee from a thermos, and kept the cab heater blowing high enough to melt the frost on the windshield. The company gave us a radio, a high-grade spotlight, an axe, and a heavy iron lining bar for clearing debris. Cell service died out entirely 15 miles north of the county highway. The night everything went wrong was a cold, miserable Tuesday. A slanting sleet had been falling since 9 o'clock, freezing as soon as it hit the steel rails and coating the spruce needles in a heavy layer of clear ice. I had set out from the yard at Millinocket around 1 in the morning, heading north toward the junction at milepost 42. The wind was whipping across the cut, howling through the open driver's side window whenever I cracked it to stay awake. By 3:15, I had reached milepost 28, a deep, rocky ravine where the tracks cut through a notch in a granite ridge. On my left was a steep rock face 50 feet high. On my right, the ground dropped straight off into a black spruce bog. As I rounded the long S-curve coming into the notch, my headlights picked up an obstruction resting dead center across the rails. Size. It was a heavy, white oak trunk, 3 feet thick, lying flat across both iron bars. I brought the truck to a stop 10 feet away, locked the hydraulic brakes, and set the transmission to park. I wasn't surprised to see a tree down after the windstorm we'd had that afternoon. But when I stepped out onto the running board and shined the handheld spotlight down at the trunk, something looked wrong. The brake wasn't jagged or splintered like a wind-blown snap. The edges were flat and smooth, marked by the distinct teeth lines of a heavy-duty chainsaw cut. I stepped down onto the icy ballast, my heavy steel-toed boots slipping slightly on the slick stones. The air was dead quiet, except for the ticking of the truck's diesel engine and the steady hiss of sleet hitting the metal hood. I walked up to the log, holding the beam of the spotlight steady. Whoever had cut the tree hadn't just felled it. They had notched it carefully so it would fall directly across the rail bed, then sliced off all the side branches so it laid completely flush against the steel. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Rail scrap thieves were common enough in the lower counties, but nobody came up into the milepost 28 notch just to mess with timber. I turned back toward the truck to grab my radio and call the dispatcher to send a maintenance crew with a saw. That was when I heard the sharp, metallic crunch of gravel behind me. Inhale. I swung the spotlight around toward the dark wall of spruce trees along the western embankment. The beam cut through the sleet, illuminating the tangled brush, but saw nothing except bare branches heavy with ice. "Hey," I shouted, my voice flat and small in the narrow granite cut. "This is private rail property. Step out where I can see you." Nobody answered. The only sound was the idle rumble of my F-350 behind me. Then the engine cut out, just died completely. The headlights flickered once, dimmed, and went total black. The radio inside the cab went dead with a soft pop. The sudden darkness hit like a physical weight. The only light left was the dying beam of my handheld spotlight, which was already starting to yellow as its battery drained in the freezing cold. I sprinted back to the driver's side of the truck, my breath coming in short, white puffs. I reached through the open window, grabbed the key, and turned it. Nothing. No click, no starter turn, no dashboard lights. Someone had popped the hood latch from the outside while I was standing at the log and pulled the main battery cables off the terminals. I reached into the cab, my hands trembling as I grabbed the heavy 4-foot iron lining bar resting behind the bench seat. It weighed nearly 18 pounds, solid forged steel with a chisel tip on one end. I backed up against the side of the truck's bed, holding the iron bar in front of me, shining the dying spotlight beam into the dark trees along the track edge. Out from the shadows of the rock face stepped a man. He wasn't wearing orange hunting gear or rail coveralls. He was dressed in a filthy, dark green insulated jumpsuit covered in black grease stains, with heavy leather welding gloves and a full-face respirator mask pulled tight over his head, the circular filter cartridges sticking out like snout filters. In his hands, he held a long, double-bitted felling axe, the polished steel edges glinting wetly in my beam. Behind him, 2 more figures emerged from the timber on the opposite side of the tracks, effectively blocking the narrow passage through the granite notch. One held a heavy iron sledgehammer. The other carried a long length of thick braided cable with a heavy iron hook attached to the end. They didn't shout. They didn't ask for money or my truck keys. They moved with the deliberate, quiet speed of men who had done this before and knew there was no cell service for 20 miles. "Back off!" I screamed, raising the iron bar, my knuckles turning white against the freezing metal. "I have a tracking beacon on this rig. The dispatcher knows exactly where I am." The man in the respirator mask took 2 slow steps forward, his boots crunching methodically on the icy ballast. His voice came out through the plastic valves as a muffled, wet rasp. "The repeater tower down at mile 22 has been lying in the creek since midnight, kid. Nobody's coming down this track until the daylight shift at 8 a.m. He swung the felling axe in a short, brutal arc, testing the balance. He wasn't trying to scare me away. He was closing the distance so he could swing without missing. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the heavy iron lining bar straight into his chest with all the weight of my body behind it. The chisel tip struck his heavy jacket, knocking him backward onto the slick rails with a sharp grunt. Groans. Before the other 2 could close the gap, I turned and bolted down the tracks, running north into the pitch-black corridor of the granite cut. The sleet slammed into my face, blinding me, but I knew the layout of the line by heart. Half a mile ahead was an old abandoned concrete powder house built during the track construction in the 1920s. It was the only cover for 5 miles. My heavy boots slammed against the wooden ties, my lungs burning as I inhaled the freezing air. Pant. Behind me, I could hear the crunch of multiple sets of boots hitting the ballast, accompanied by the clinking sound of iron tools swaying against leather belts. They weren't sprinting. They were keeping a steady, trotting pace, knowing the icy terrain would tire me out long before I reached the highway. I reached the concrete powder house in 3 minutes, my heart hammering like a engine against my ribs. It was a small, windowless box made of 8-inch poured concrete, set 20 feet back from the rail bed against the granite cliff. The iron door was hanging half off its hinges, rusted through at the bottom. I ducked inside, smelling damp earth, old rot, and wet stone, and shoved the rusted iron door shut as far as it would go, jamming a heavy granite stone against the base to hold it. I stood in the pitch darkness inside the bunker, my chest heaving, listening to the rain beat against the roof. Pant outside, the footsteps slowed down as they reached the clearing in front of the structure. I heard the scrape of steel against stone right outside the thin iron door. "He's inside," a voice rasped from the other side of the concrete wall. It was one of the men from the trees. "Jam the frame. We'll set the brush against the door and light the diesel." My blood turned to ice water. They weren't going to break the door down and fight me in the dark where I could use the space. They were going to burn me out or suffocate me with wet spruce smoke. Through the gap at the bottom of the rusted door, I heard the heavy drag of pine branches being piled up against the iron frame, followed by the distinct smell of raw diesel fuel being poured over wet wood. Panic turned into a hot spike of adrenaline. I looked around the dark interior of the small bunker, my eyes slowly adapting to the faint gray light leaking through a vent hole near the ceiling. In the corner lay a pile of abandoned wooden track shims and an old rusted maintenance shovel with a broken ash handle. I grabbed the shovel shaft, wedging the flat steel blade under the rusted bottom lip of the iron door. Outside, a match struck once, twice, and then a thick plume of black, greasy diesel smoke came billowing under the door frame, stinging my eyes and filling my throat with suffocating chemical fumes. Coughs. I slammed my whole body weight down on the shovel handle, using the tool as a lever against the concrete threshold. The bottom hinge of the rusted iron door snapped with a loud, metallic crack. The heavy door buckled outward, knocking the pile of flaming spruce branches back into the faces of the two men standing closest to the entrance. Gasps. One of them let out a high-pitched scream as the burning diesel splattered across his insulated pants, lighting his legs instantly. I threw myself through the gap, barreling straight into the man holding the sledgehammer. The collision knocked us both down into the mud and flaming debris. He grabbed my jacket collar with a gloved hand, his eyes wide and wild behind his goggles, trying to draw a heavy hunting knife from his belt with his free hand. I grabbed the heavy granite stone I had used as a doorstop and slammed it downward with everything I had, straight into his wrist. There was a wet crunch, and he dropped the blade, letting out a ragged gasp of pain. Groans. I scrambled out from under him, kicking his chest to shove him off, and broke into a dead run down the embankment toward the black waters of the spruce bog. Behind me, the man in the respirator mask was shouting orders, his axe swinging as he cut through the brush to cut off my angle to the stream bed. I plunged into the freezing water of the creek that ran along the bog edge, the ice-cold water shocking my system so hard I nearly lost my footing. The current was fast, pulled down by the heavy rains, reaching up to my waist. I kept my head down and let the dark water carry me downstream, hiding beneath the overhang of icy spruce branches that slumped over the banks. I stayed in that freezing water for 20 minutes, drifting quietly down the ravine, my fingers completely numb, my teeth chattering so hard I had to bite down on my jacket sleeve to stay quiet. Above me on the ridge, I saw the yellow beams of their flashlights sweeping back and forth across the rail line, searching the ballast where they thought I had run. By 4:45 in the morning, the lights on the ridge had finally faded back toward the south. I dragged myself out of the creek onto the gravel of an old logging spur road 2 miles north of the notch. My clothes were frozen stiff, my skin was gray, and I couldn't feel my feet inside my boots. I walked for another hour in the dark, staggering along the logging road until I hit the timber company's north gate on Highway 11. A logging truck driver spotted me sitting against the gate post at 6 in the morning, shivering so violently I couldn't spell my own name. He pulled me into his warm cab, wrapped me in a moving blanket, and called the state police from his satellite phone. The police found my rail truck 3 hours later. It was sitting in the same spot at milepost 28, but the cab had been stripped clean. The tools, the brass fittings, the radio gear, and even the heavy copper wiring from under the dashboard had been yanked out with crowbars. The men were gone, leaving behind only the burnt pile of spruce branches and footprints that disappeared into the granite ridges. The doctors at the hospital in Bangor had to cut 2 toes off my left foot due to severe frostbite, and I spent 3 weeks recovering from hypothermia and a fractured rib. I quit the railway company the next month and took a job at an auto parts warehouse in Portland. It's been 8 years now, but I still keep a heavy iron pry bar beside my bed, and I never turn off the lights before checking the deadbolts twice. Because last winter, I opened my mailbox on a rainy Tuesday and found a rusted, bent bolt cutter blade wrapped in a piece of greasy, diesel-soaked shop rag with no return address on the envelope. The gravel road leading up to the Black Pine Ridge was 4 miles of washed-out mud and frozen ruts. I was driving an old 3-ton flatbed truck with a dead heater, hauling 2 diesel generators up to a temporary cell relay site near the Canadian border. It was midnight. The rain was turning into heavy, wet sleet, and the forest on both sides of the road was so thick you couldn't see 5 feet past the ditch. I had been driving for 6 hours, my hands numb on the plastic steering wheel, listening to the loose steel chains clanking against the wooden bed behind the cab. Up here, there were no radio stations, no streetlights, and no passing traffic, just miles of dark timber and granite cuts. My head was pounding from the diesel fumes leaking through the floorboards. About 2 miles from the summit, the truck's high beams caught a dark shape sitting dead center in the middle of the road. I stepped on the brakes, the heavy tires skidding through the slush before the truck came to a hard stop about 15 feet away. I thought it was a fallen branch or a dead deer, but when I leaned over the dashboard to look closer, it was a heavy wooden picnic table, flipped upside down and jammed across the narrow lane with thick iron spikes driven into the legs. I pulled the air brake lever, letting the cab fill with the sharp hiss of compressed air, and sat there with the engine idling. I wasn't an idiot. A table spiked into the dirt road wasn't an accident. I reached down into the gap between the seats and pulled out a heavy 2-foot tire iron, gripping the cold steel in my right hand. I didn't turn off the truck, and I didn't leave the cab. That's when the driver's side window shattered inward with a deafening crack. A heavy iron crowbar smashed through the glass, raining sharp safety shards down onto my neck and lap. Long, filthy fingers reached through the broken frame, grabbing the front of my canvas jacket, yanking me hard against the door panel. The smell that hit me was nauseating stale tobacco, wet fur, and sour, rotten meat. I screamed, swinging the tire iron wild in the dark cab. The heavy steel bar connected with something solid, a shoulder or an arm, and I heard a wet, raspy grunt from outside the door. The grip on my jacket loosened just enough for me to shove myself backward toward the passenger seat, kicking frantically at the steering wheel. In the glare of the dashboard lights, a man was leaning through the shattered window frame. He was massive, wearing a heavy, grease-stained oilskin coat with a filthy burlap sack pulled over his head, 2 crude, uneven eye holes cut into the rough fabric. In his left hand, he held a long, hand-forged butcher knife with a dark, pitted steel blade. Pant. He didn't say a word. He just reached down, unlocked the door handle from the inside, and yanked the heavy truck door wide open. The freezing gale blew sleet straight into the cab. I scrambled out the passenger side door, throwing my weight against the handle, tumbling headfirst onto the wet, muddy gravel of the road. The fall knocked the wind out of my lungs, making my vision go white for a second. Groans. I scrambled up on my hands and knees, my boots slipping in the frozen slush, and sprinted down the dark road toward the steep timberline, leaving the truck behind with its engine roaring in the dark. I plunged straight into the thick spruce trees, the sharp needles tearing at my cheeks and hands as I forced my way through the brush. The forest was pitch black, filled with the roar of the wind and the heavy slap of rain against the canopy. I couldn't see where my boots were landing. I was just running on raw adrenaline, tripping over exposed roots and crashing into rotten logs. Behind me, over the sound of the storm, I heard his boots slamming hard against the gravel lane, followed by the wet, heavy crunch of brush snapping as he entered the woods right behind me. He was moving with terrifying speed, tracking me by the noise I was making through the undergrowth. I slammed my knee straight into a hidden granite boulder and went down hard, sliding 5 feet down a slippery mud slope into a narrow creek bed at the bottom of a ravine. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, burning pain shooting up my left leg. I couldn't stand, let alone run, pant. I dragged myself backward through the freezing creek water, pulling my legs under the hollowed-out root system of a massive fallen cedar tree. The mud was ice cold, soaking straight through my jeans. I pressed my back flat against the wet dirt, covering my mouth with both hands, trying to suppress the loud, ragged gasps coming from my chest. A few seconds later, the heavy snapping of branches stopped right above the ravine. Through the tangled cedar roots, I saw the dim glow of an iron lantern sweeping back and forth across the muddy slope. He was standing 20 feet away at the top of the ridge, holding the yellow light high, his heavy burlap mask soaked red with rainwater. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a long, rusted steel whistle, and blew into it. A high, shrieking tone pierced the night storm, echoing off the distant granite ridges. And then, from deep within the dark timber, half a mile further up the mountain, 3 more whistles answered back. He wasn't working alone up on that ridge. It was a hunting party. He turned his head slowly toward the ravine, the yellow lantern light catching the dark, empty eye holes of his burlap mask as he took his first slow step down the muddy slope toward the creek bed. I squeezed further back into the cold mud under the root ball, my fingers digging into the rotting wood, praying that the dark water would wash away my trail before he reached the bottom of the bank. I gripped the iron tire bar so tight, my fingers went entirely numb, waiting for the lantern light to hit my face. The heavy crunch of his boots grew louder with every second, splashing directly into the creek water just 10 feet from where I was crouching. He stopped. I could hear his heavy, wet breathing through the damp cloth of the mask, mixed with the metallic drip of water falling off the steel blade of his butcher knife. He raised the lantern, lowering his head to look directly into the gap beneath the cedar roots. The yellow light washed over my soaked boots. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of us moved. The world narrowed down to the sound of my hammering heart and the freezing rain pouring down my neck. I didn't wait for him to reach into the dark. I swung the 2-foot tire iron outward with every last ounce of strength I had left, driving the heavy steel hook straight into the side of the glass lantern. The iron lantern exploded into a shower of white sparks and burning kerosene. The flame caught his grease-soaked coat instantly, a wall of yellow fire roaring up his arm and chest. The man let out a terrifying, guttural howl of rage and pain, dropping the knife as he stumbled backward into the deep creek water, thrashing wildly to put out the blaze. I shoved myself out from under the root ball, ignoring the blinding pain in my left knee, and dragged my body up the opposite side of the ravine using the low spruce branches as handholds. I scrambled over the crest, my hands slick with mud and burning kerosene, and threw myself blindly into the dark woods beyond. I crawled and limped through 2 miles of freezing swamp and sharp granite outcrops in total darkness, guided only by the distant hum of the county highway. I didn't look back once. Every time the wind screamed through the high pine canopy, it sounded like those whistles echoing across the ridge behind me. At 4 a.m, I collapsed onto the shoulder of Highway 9, where a state trooper found me soaked in mud, blood, and kerosene. They sent 3 armed units up the mountain road at dawn. They found my truck. Its engine was missing, The heavy diesel generators had been unbolted and dragged into the woods, and the tire iron was lying in the creek bed, rusted shut with burnt fabric. They never found the men, the camp, or the road spiked with iron. I moved out of the county 3 weeks later and never took another long-haul night delivery again. But every winter, when the sleet starts hitting my window and the wind whistles through the power lines, I catch myself holding my breath, waiting to hear that sharp, answering shriek from the trees.